It was a quiet evening in the city. The sun had just disappeared behind the buildings, leaving the streets bathed in a soft orange glow that slowly faded into night. Most people were either at home relaxing after a long day, or rushing to finish errands before the shops closed. On one of the quieter streets, a man was walking home after a long shift. He had spent the day working hard at a small local store, helping customers, stocking shelves, and making sure everything ran smoothly. He was tired, but he had always believed in finishing his work honestly and with pride. He walked calmly, carrying a small bag with his belongings. His head was down, thinking about dinner and maybe watching a little TV when he got home. The street was empty except for a few parked cars, the occasional passerby, and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. He didn't notice the police car that slowly turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Inside the car, 2 officers were on routine patrol. They had been working long hours and their day had been tense. They were tired and frustrated, and their minds were already on the next case or report they had to file. When they saw the man walking, something about his presence made them uneasy. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was just one of those moments where their judgment was clouded by stress and assumptions. They decided to pull over and confront him. The man noticed the police car slowing down behind him. At first he thought it might be a simple question, maybe asking if he was okay or if he had seen anything unusual. He had no reason to worry. But as the car stopped and the officers got out, he realized this would not be a normal encounter. Their expressions were stern, their movements sharp, and the air suddenly felt heavy with tension. One of the officers stepped forward and asked for his identification. The man complied, reaching slowly into his pocket to grab his wallet. He kept his hands visible and spoke politely, explaining where he was coming from and where he was going. But the officers were not listening. Their voices were loud, their tone aggressive, and their body language threatening. One of them grabbed him roughly, spinning him around without warning. The man felt a sharp pain in his shoulder and stumbled slightly, trying to keep his balance. He tried to stay calm, speaking clearly and asking what he had done wrong. But the officers ignored his words. They assumed the worst, acting before thinking, and in their heightened state they crossed a line. What began as a simple stop escalated into something dangerous and unfair. They struck him with their hands, pushing him against the wall of a nearby building. The sound of the impact echoed slightly in the quiet street. The man winced but did not fight back. He knew that reacting aggressively would only make things worse. He kept repeating his words, hoping they would hear reason, hoping they would remember the oath they had taken to protect people rather than harm them. From a distance, a few neighbors had noticed the commotion. Some peeked from their windows while others stepped outside cautiously. A woman across the street fumbled for her phone, starting to record the scene. She could see the man trying to explain himself while the officers continued their harsh actions. Her hands shook as she filmed, but she felt it was important to capture what was happening. Around her, other residents began to gather quietly, murmuring to each other in disbelief. They had never seen something like this happen in their neighborhood before. The man's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a mixture of fear, confusion, and frustration. He had never done anything wrong, yet here he was being assaulted by people who were supposed to uphold the law. His mind raced, thinking about how this could ruin his life, how it could be misunderstood, and how people would judge him unfairly. But despite all the chaos around him, he remained calm in his own way. He did not shout, he did not attack back, and he did not give up hope that this could somehow end without lasting damage. The officers, on the other hand, were caught up in the moment. Their frustration had taken over their judgment. They acted as if the man's silence or hesitation was proof of guilt, as if his polite attempts to communicate were disrespectful. Each shove, each harsh word, and each action they took pushed the situation further from control. Yet there was a part of them deep down that still knew something was wrong. But pride, stress, and the heat of the moment prevented them from stopping. The bystanders continued to film, their voices low but urgent, trying not to escalate the tension. The woman across the street whispered into her phone, asking friends to call the authorities and to send the video to anyone who could help. The presence of witnesses made the officers slightly hesitant for the first time. But it wasn't enough to halt their aggression. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to the man, one of the officers took a step back. His chest heaved as he tried to regain control of his breathing. He looked at the man again, this time noticing his calm expression, his clear and steady eyes, and the quiet dignity in the way he stood despite the assault. For a moment, the officer paused, feeling a strange twinge of guilt, a small voice inside that whispered, "Maybe we are wrong." But it was just a flicker, and the tension in the air was still thick. The man, sensing even a small hesitation, continued speaking calmly. He explained that he had done nothing wrong, that he was just walking home after work, that he had always respected the law and the community. His words were steady, honest, and full of truth. Slowly, the surrounding neighbors began to murmur words of support, encouraging him silently, hoping the officers would listen. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. The officers were trapped between their initial reaction and the faint realization that they might have made a serious mistake. The man did not show anger, did not show hatred. He simply stood there, enduring, explaining, and staying human in a situation that had stripped everyone else of reason. Eventually, the officers released their grip. The man rubbed his sore shoulder but remained composed. His eyes met theirs, not with hatred but with a quiet expectation that they would understand the gravity of what had just happened. The witnesses around them exhaled slowly, relieved that the physical aggression had stopped, though the tension remained. The man walked a few steps backward to create distance. He kept his hands visible, careful not to provoke further aggression. The officers muttered something to each other, glancing at the growing crowd, and then retreated slightly. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The man had survived without losing his composure, without compromising his dignity. The street, though still tense, began to return to its usual calm, as neighbors whispered reassurances to each other and to the man. That night, as the man finally continued walking home, he could feel the aches in his body, but also the strength in his spirit. He knew the incident would not be forgotten, that it would leave a mark, not just on him, but on the officers and the entire neighborhood. It was a moment of injustice, yes, but also a moment that could teach lessons if handled properly. Little did he know that the events of this evening were only the beginning. The video recorded by the neighbors would soon circulate, drawing attention from all corners of the city. The officers, who had acted so impulsively, would begin to face the consequences of their actions. And the man, despite the pain and humiliation he had endured, would show the world what it meant to remain calm, human, and dignified in the face of aggression. This evening, which had begun as a simple walk home, had turned into a story of confrontation, endurance, and the first seeds of reflection. The quiet streets that had witnessed the assault would soon witness the ripple effects of that night, affecting lives, attitudes, and the very sense of justice in the community. The man finally reached his small apartment, tired but not defeated. He sat down on his bed, reflecting on what had happened. He knew the officers might never fully understand the impact of their actions unless they were forced to confront it. He also knew that he could use this experience not for revenge, but to highlight the importance of empathy, fairness, and human dignity. In the silence of his room, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would not let this incident define him, but he would let it inspire change, one step at a time. Outside, the city continued to hum quietly. The lights flickered in the distance, cars moved along the streets, and people went about their lives. But on that particular street, in that quiet moment, something had changed. A line had been crossed, lessons had been learned, and a story had begun that would not be forgotten. The next morning, the city was buzzing with news. The video recorded by the neighbors had quickly spread across social media. People were shocked, angry, and confused. In the footage, anyone could clearly see what had happened. The man being confronted aggressively, the assault, and the way he had stayed calm despite everything. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It was capturing attention from all over the city. People were sharing the video, commenting on it, and expressing their outrage. Some were demanding justice, while others were calling for the officers to be held accountable. The man woke up that morning with a mixture of emotions. He was still sore from the assault, and his body ached in places he hadn't noticed before. But what weighed heavier on his mind was the knowledge that this moment would now be visible to thousands, maybe millions of people. He thought about his family and friends, worrying they would be hurt or embarrassed by what had happened. Yet he also realized that the video could be a way to show the truth, a way to hold people accountable, and maybe even create change. His phone started buzzing nonstop. Messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers poured in. People offered their support, sent words of encouragement, and asked if he was okay. Some messages were angry, urging him to take action immediately, while others were more cautious, reminding him to stay calm and think carefully about his next steps. He felt a strange mix of comfort and pressure. He appreciated the concern, but he also knew that the situation was delicate. One wrong move and it could all spiral out of control. Meanwhile, the two officers who had assaulted him were beginning to feel the consequences of their actions. They had returned home the previous night thinking the incident was over, that it would be just another difficult shift no one would remember. But the reality was very different. By morning, their phones were flooded with messages, calls from their superiors, and alerts about the video spreading online. The police department itself had been forced to respond, launching an internal investigation and placing both officers on administrative leave. Suddenly, what had seemed like a minor encounter had turned into a serious issue that could affect their careers, reputations, and even their freedom. At first, the officers were defensive. They told themselves that they had been following procedure, that the man must have been suspicious in some way, and that the public didn't understand the pressures of their job. But as the hours passed, the video replayed in their minds over and over. The calmness of the man, the way he had tried to explain himself, and the way the neighbors had recorded everything, it was undeniable. They had overreacted. They had used unnecessary force, and the truth was there for everyone to see. The city's residents began to gather outside the police station. Some were protesting peacefully, holding signs calling for justice. Others were discussing the event in small groups on the streets, sharing their thoughts and fears. They wanted accountability, but they also wanted the situation to lead to meaningful change. Local news channels picked up the story, interviewing witnesses and experts who discussed the importance of proper policing and the dangers of letting emotions take over in moments of stress. The man's courage in staying calm under pressure was highlighted repeatedly. People admired how he had handled the situation without retaliation, even when he had every reason to feel anger and fear. Back at home, the man was trying to process everything. He reflected on the assault, on the officer's aggression, and on the attention the video had attracted. He thought about the community, about how incidents like this affected trust between the public and the police. He realized that while he had suffered, there was a bigger story here, one about fairness, empathy, and the need for people in positions of authority to act responsibly. Despite his own pain, he felt a quiet determination. He wanted to make sure this story would not be forgotten, that it would be a lesson for everyone involved, and that it would help prevent similar situations in the future. The officers, meanwhile, were beginning to feel the first real pangs of guilt. They spoke to colleagues and family members trying to explain what had happened, but they couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The internal investigation was thorough, and there were already discussions about potential disciplinary action. Their families expressed disappointment and concern, reminding them of the oath they had taken to serve the community, not harm it. Slowly, the officers began to realize that this wasn't just about them losing face. It was about the impact of their actions on another human being. As the day continued, the man received calls from lawyers and advocacy groups who wanted to support him. They explained the legal steps he could take and the importance of documenting everything carefully. He listened attentively, asking questions and taking notes. He wanted to be sure that his actions would be fair and measured. At the same time, he had to deal with the physical pain from the assault. Bruises had appeared on his arms and shoulders, and the soreness in his back reminded him of every push and shove from the night before. But he refused to let the pain control him. He moved carefully, rested when he could, and kept focused on the bigger picture. The city's response continued to grow. People were discussing the incident at work, in schools, and at community centers. Some were angry, some were fearful, but many were inspired by the man's calmness and dignity. They began talking about the need for training, accountability, and better communication between police officers and the community. The video had sparked a larger conversation, one that no one could ignore. It became clear that the impact of that single night would not fade quickly. It was only the beginning of a much longer story. By evening, the officers were forced to confront their actions more directly. Their superiors called them in for questioning. They had to explain their side of the story while facing undeniable evidence. The man's composed demeanor and the clarity of the video made it difficult for them to justify their behavior. For the first time, they were forced to see the situation from the perspective of the man and the community. They couldn't just blame stress, tiredness, or misunderstanding. They had made a serious mistake, and it was time to own it. The man, despite everything, remained focused on fairness. He did not want to humiliate the officers. He wanted accountability and understanding. He wanted them to realize the consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for everyone who trusted law enforcement to act justly. He also knew that the incident could serve as a lesson for others, both officers and civilians alike. By staying calm, documenting the event, and seeking the right kind of support, he was creating a path for dialogue, understanding, and change. Neighbors and community members continued to check in on him. Some brought food, others offered rides, and a few simply came by to listen. The man appreciated their support but was careful not to let the attention distract him. He focused on healing physically, planning his next steps legally, and reflecting on what had happened. He knew this was more than just a personal experience. It was a story that could influence how people saw authority, justice, and human dignity. That night, the city seemed to hold its breath. People talked quietly in homes, on porches, and in shops. The video of the incident had sparked debates about policing, fairness, and respect. It had shown how quickly a normal evening could turn into a moment of fear and injustice, and how courage, composure, and dignity could make a difference. The man, lying in bed that night, thought about the officers too. He wondered if they were beginning to understand the consequences of what they had done, if they were feeling the weight of their actions, and if they would take this chance to reflect and change. The next few days would be critical. The officers' superiors would review the case. The community would continue to respond, and the man would need to make decisions about legal action. But in this moment, there was a quiet sense that something important had begun. The video, the attention, and the growing awareness in the city had turned a painful incident into a starting point for accountability and reflection. Despite the fear, the pain, and the uncertainty, the man felt a quiet confidence. He had endured aggression without losing himself. He had stayed calm when others would have lost control, and he had become the center of a story that was bigger than any single person. It was a story about justice, human dignity, and the possibility of change. For the officers, the morning after the video went viral was the first time they truly understood the impact of their actions. Their decisions in that moment of stress and anger had consequences far beyond what they imagined. They were beginning to realize that their mistake had affected not just one man, but the community, the trust in law enforcement, and their own sense of morality. For the first time, guilt was not something they could push aside. It was real, it was heavy, and it was unavoidable. And so, as the sun set on the second day after the incident, the city waited. People waited to see what would happen next, how the officers would respond, and how the man would continue to navigate the aftermath. What had started as a simple walk home had grown into a story that would not be forgotten, a story that would challenge people to think about fairness, responsibility, and the courage it takes to stay human in the face of injustice. After the video of the incident went viral, the two officers could no longer ignore what they had done. At first, they tried to push it out of their minds, convincing themselves that the public would forget soon, that they had just acted under pressure, and that no real harm had been done. But as the hours passed, the reality hit them harder. Every time they picked up their phones, there were messages reminding them of that night, comments, news alerts, and messages from colleagues. Their families and friends were also asking questions, some gently, some with clear disappointment. At home, one of the officers sat alone in his living room, staring at the ceiling. His mind kept replaying the man's calm face, the way he had stood quietly despite the pain and the dignity he had shown while being assaulted. The officer felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He had trained for years, learned how to follow protocol, and believed he knew how to handle tense situations. Yet in that moment he had acted impulsively, letting anger and stress take control. He realized that it wasn't just about him or his pride. It was about the trust he had broken, the pain he had caused, and the example he had set for his colleagues and community. His partner felt the same. At first, he had justified the actions in his own mind. He told himself that the man had been suspicious, that he had to act fast to protect the public, and that no one would understand the pressures of his job. But the footage told the truth clearly. There was no question about it. The man had been calm, respectful, and completely compliant. They had overreacted. They had used unnecessary force. And now, the evidence was everywhere. The officers were soon required to attend mandatory counseling sessions as part of the internal investigation. At first, they were resistant, thinking it was just another formality, another thing to endure. But as they sat in the quiet room with the counselor, the reality of their actions began to settle in. They were asked to recount the event in detail, to reflect on what they had been thinking, and to consider the man's perspective. This exercise was uncomfortable, even painful, but it was necessary. They could no longer hide behind excuses or self-justification. During the sessions, the officers were forced to watch the video again. At first, they tried to look away, not wanting to face the truth, but the counselor insisted they watch closely, not just the assault, but the man's reactions, the way the bystanders recorded it, and the impact of their actions on everyone around them. The officers began to feel something they hadn't expected: shame. It was a deep, gnawing feeling, the kind that comes from knowing you have caused harm to someone who did not deserve it. One of the officers admitted aloud what he had been thinking at the time of the assault. He said he felt fear, stress, and a need to assert control, but now he could see that those feelings had no excuse for what he had done. His partner nodded in agreement, adding that the man's composure had forced him to confront his own lack of self-control. They both realized that their actions were not just a mistake. They were a violation of the very principles they had sworn to uphold. Outside of the counseling sessions, their daily lives had changed too. Colleagues were cautious around them, some whispering about the incident, others offering quiet support. Friends and family were still processing their disappointment, and the officers began to see how their behavior had affected not just the man and his community, but everyone connected to them. The weight of responsibility felt heavy, but it also pushed them to reflect more deeply on their roles and how they needed to change. Meanwhile, the man continued with his life, though the incident lingered in his mind. He had started speaking with legal advisors, advocacy groups, and community leaders. He wanted to ensure that justice was served, and that the story would highlight the importance of accountability and empathy. Yet he remained human in his approach. He did not seek revenge or humiliation for the officers. He simply wanted acknowledgement of the wrongdoing, and a chance for the officers to understand the impact of their actions. Back in the officers' homes, the sense of guilt grew stronger with each passing day. Simple things like hearing a neighbor's laughter or seeing people on the street reminded them of the man and the moment they had lost control. They began to question their own values, their training, and the kind of officers they wanted to be. It wasn't enough to apologize privately or to hope the community would forget. They needed to confront the truth, take responsibility, and make amends. One evening, one of the officers took out a notebook. He began writing down everything he remembered from that night, every thought, every action, every feeling. At first, it was painful, even humiliating. But as he wrote, he started to see the incident from the man's perspective. He imagined the fear and confusion, the pain and injustice, and it struck him how completely wrong they had been. Writing became a small form of therapy, a way to organize his thoughts and emotions and to begin the process of understanding and change. The other officer did something similar. He spoke with his partner, sharing his reflections openly without excuses or justifications. They admitted to each other that their actions were unacceptable and that they had failed in their duty to protect and serve. The admission was difficult, but it was also a relief. For the first time, they were being completely honest with themselves and each other. It was the beginning of accountability, not just in words, but in their hearts. As the days passed, the officers also started to see the broader implications of the incident. They realized that what they had done could have caused long-term harm to the man's trust in law enforcement, to community relations, and to the reputation of their own department. They could not undo what had happened, but they could work to prevent similar mistakes in the future. They began researching proper procedures, attending additional training sessions, and asking for guidance on how to handle high-pressure situations without letting emotions take over. The man, during this time, noticed subtle changes. He heard through mutual acquaintances that the officers were taking steps to reflect and improve. Though he did not interact with them directly yet, he sensed that their actions were being influenced by the community's response and by their own growing sense of guilt. He continued to focus on his own healing, both physically and emotionally, while preparing for any future meetings or legal proceedings. One evening, one of the officers sat alone, thinking about the man's composure, his calm voice, and the quiet strength he had displayed during the assault. He realized that the man had taught him a lesson without saying a word, a lesson about dignity, patience, and the power of staying human even when treated unfairly. This realization brought tears to his eyes. He had never imagined that he could learn such a profound lesson from someone he had harmed, but the truth was undeniable. The officers began to consider how they could make amends. They discussed the possibility of a formal apology, of participating in community programs, and of sharing their experience as a cautionary tale for other officers. They wanted their regret to be genuine, not performative, and they understood that actions would speak louder than words. They also knew that the man had the right to choose whether or not to engage with them, and they respected that. At the same time, the officers continued to struggle with self-reflection. There were moments when anger, frustration, and defensiveness resurfaced. They had to remind themselves repeatedly that these feelings did not justify their past behavior. Each time they faltered, they returned to the video, to the man's calmness, and to the clear evidence of their mistake. Over time, the feelings of guilt transformed into motivation to become better officers, better human beings, and better members of the community. The man's story had now reached a wider audience. News outlets and community forums discussed not only the assault, but also the officers' growing recognition of their wrongdoing. People were interested in how accountability could lead to personal growth, and how a single moment of injustice could spark reflection and change. The man remained humble, acknowledging that he had been hurt, but emphasizing that the most important thing was learning, understanding, and preventing similar incidents in the future. By the end of Part 3, both the officers were in a different place mentally and emotionally than they had been on the night of the assault. They were no longer defensive or dismissive. They were reflective, remorseful, and beginning to understand the human impact of their actions. They were starting to see that true responsibility meant facing the consequences, acknowledging harm, and striving to do better in the future. And while the man continued his life, focused on healing and justice, the officer's journey of reflection and growth was just beginning. The events of that night had left a deep mark on everyone involved. But they also offered an opportunity for accountability, learning, and ultimately change. After days of reflection and counseling, the officers finally reached a point where they understood the gravity of their actions. Their guilt had transformed into determination, not just to acknowledge the harm they had caused, but to take steps toward making things right. They knew that words alone would not be enough, and that any attempt to apologize without action would feel hollow. So they began preparing for a meeting with the man, a meeting that would be guided by community leaders and mediators to ensure it was safe, respectful, and meaningful. The man had been informed that the officers wanted to meet him. At first, he felt a mix of surprise, caution, and skepticism. He remembered clearly the pain, fear, and humiliation he had endured during the assault. The physical marks had begun to fade, but the emotional impact lingered. He wondered whether the officers were sincere, or whether this was just an attempt to save face in front of the public. Despite these thoughts, he agreed to meet, with the understanding that it could be a chance for genuine accountability and perhaps even reconciliation. On the day of the meeting, the community center where it was held was quiet but tense. A few community leaders and mediators were present to guide the conversation and ensure that it remained respectful. The officers arrived, visibly nervous, their faces showing a mix of remorse and anxiety. The man waited patiently, his demeanor calm, dignified, and cautious. From the very beginning, it was clear that this meeting would be about more than just words. It would be about understanding, reflection, and the possibility of growth. The meeting began with introductions and explanations of the purpose. The mediator spoke gently but firmly, reminding everyone that the goal was accountability, understanding, and moving forward, not revenge. The officers took a deep breath and began to speak. They did not make excuses. They did not justify their actions with stress or pressure. They spoke openly and honestly about the incident, acknowledging the harm they had caused and the fear they had inflicted. One of the officers said, "I want to apologize for what I did. I let my anger and frustration take control, and I know I hurt you. I cannot take back what happened, but I want to take responsibility and learn from it." His voice was steady but filled with genuine regret. His partner added, "We acted unfairly and violated the trust we were supposed to uphold. We understand that our actions were wrong, and we are committed to making sure this never happens again." The man listened carefully. He could see the sincerity in their eyes, the weight of their words, and the obvious struggle they had gone through to confront themselves. He felt a mix of relief and cautious hope. This was not just an apology for the sake of appearances. This was an acknowledgement of responsibility, a rare moment of human honesty in a world where many would have hidden behind excuses. After hearing their words, the man spoke. He did not yell or accuse. He explained how the incident had affected him, the physical pain, the emotional shock, and the fear he had felt walking home that night. He spoke about the community, the trust that had been broken, and the need for officers to remember that they serve people, not just rules. His words were calm, clear, and full of dignity. They were a reminder that even in moments of wrongdoing, the humanity of both sides could still be recognized. The officers listened quietly, absorbing every word. It was difficult, even painful, to hear how deeply they had affected someone else's life, but they understood that this was an essential part of their growth. They could not move forward without fully comprehending the impact of their actions. The mediators helped guide the conversation, ensuring that it remained constructive, allowing the man to speak honestly, while giving the officers a chance to respond thoughtfully. After a while, the discussion shifted to steps the officers could take to make amends. They agreed to participate in community programs, attend additional training on de-escalation and empathy, and speak publicly about their experience as a lesson for others. They wanted their regret to be meaningful, not performative. They knew that the man had the right to accept or reject their actions, and they were prepared to respect his decisions. The man, while still cautious, saw the potential for positive change. He understood that this incident could serve as an example of how accountability and reflection could lead to growth, even in situations that began with harm and injustice. He offered guidance on how the officers could contribute to the community in a way that was sincere and respectful. This included participating in outreach programs, speaking at local schools about the importance of empathy, and volunteering in ways that built trust rather than undermined it. The conversation continued for hours. It was not always easy. There were moments of tension, moments when past anger and fear resurfaced, and moments when silence felt heavy. But through it all, the focus remained on understanding and accountability. Both the man and the officers realized that this was a rare opportunity to transform a painful event into a lesson for themselves, their community, and anyone who might witness their story. As the meeting drew to a close, there was a quiet sense of resolution. The man expressed that he appreciated the officers' willingness to face their mistakes, to reflect deeply, and to take meaningful steps toward making amends. He did not feel fully healed, and he did not forget the pain of that night. But he felt a sense of hope that positive change could emerge from this difficult situation. The officers, for their part, felt the weight of responsibility and the beginnings of redemption. They understood that words alone were not enough, but actions would be the path forward. Outside the community center, the air felt different. People who had been watching from a distance could sense the change. The story was no longer just about an assault or public outrage. It had evolved into something deeper. It was about reflection, empathy, and the power of human beings to learn from their mistakes. The man walked away with a renewed sense of dignity, knowing that he had faced a challenging situation with courage and grace. The officers left with a commitment to do better, to honor the trust that had been broken, and to ensure that future actions would reflect the lessons they had learned. Over the following weeks, the officers began participating actively in community programs. They attended workshops, spoke about their experience, and shared the lessons they had learned with new recruits and fellow officers. They emphasized the importance of restraint, empathy, and understanding in every situation. Their story became an example of how reflection and accountability could lead to personal growth, even after serious mistakes. The man continued his advocacy quietly but powerfully. He spoke to local groups about the importance of dignity, calmness, and documentation when facing injustice. He emphasized that while anger and fear were natural, they could be channeled in ways that preserved humanity and promoted positive outcomes. His story inspired others in the community to reflect on their own actions and to consider how they might respond with empathy and integrity in difficult situations. The incident, once a moment of fear and aggression, had transformed into a story of reconciliation and learning. The officer's willingness to confront their actions, the man's courage in responding with dignity, and the support of the community created a ripple effect. People began talking about accountability in new ways, recognizing that mistakes could be corrected if approached honestly, thoughtfully, and with a commitment to growth. By the end of Part 4, the relationship between the officers and the man had shifted. While trust had been broken and could not be fully restored immediately, there was a foundation of understanding and accountability. The man had demonstrated resilience and grace, and the officers had shown the capacity for reflection, remorse, and positive action. Together, they had turned a painful encounter into a catalyst for awareness, learning, and potential change within the community. The story began to appear in local news outlets and community discussions, not just as a tale of wrongdoing, but as an example of how humans could confront mistakes, take responsibility, and work toward making things right. It highlighted the power of empathy, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of growth even after serious errors. For everyone involved, the journey was far from over, but Part 4 marked a turning point. The moment when regret transformed into meaningful action, and when pain became an opportunity for understanding and change. And so, as the city moved forward, the night of the assault became more than just a dark memory. It became a reminder that even in the worst situations, people could choose reflection over denial, responsibility over excuses, and empathy over indifference. The man continued his life with quiet strength. The officers worked to repair trust and improve themselves, and the community began to see the value of accountability, dialogue, and the possibility of positive transformation. After the meeting at the community center, life began to take on a new rhythm for everyone involved. The man returned to his daily routine, though he was changed in ways that went beyond the physical. He had always been calm and patient, but now there was a quiet strength that came from having faced injustice and choosing dignity over anger. The memory of the assault still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. Instead, it became a reminder of how resilience and composure could influence not only his own life, but the wider community around him. He started connecting with people in his neighborhood more intentionally. He spoke with friends, family, and even strangers about the incident, not to dwell on the past, but to encourage awareness and thoughtful responses in difficult situations. He shared his experience of remaining calm, documenting the event, and engaging with legal and community support to seek justice. People began to see him as more than a victim. They saw him as someone who could turn hardship into learning and action. Meanwhile, the officers continued their journey of reflection and change. They remained involved in counseling and training programs, and they actively participated in community outreach. They spoke at workshops, schools, and local gatherings about the importance of empathy, restraint, and understanding. Their story, once one of wrongdoing and public outrage, had become a cautionary tale for other officers, demonstrating the profound impact that reflection, accountability, and sincere effort could have on personal growth and community trust. Despite the ongoing tension from the past, both the man and the officers understood that moving forward required genuine,